This is it, everybody. The big 6v6 blog from Aaron Keller. This is, of course, comparing 6v6 to 5v5 and breaking down where the developers are with this and what's going to happen in the future. Now, I'm going to give you guys the TLDR in case you don't want to watch the video. If you do, then I suggest you get a drink because this is a pretty long video. I mean, I'll just very quickly scroll down. It's a massive, I mean, we've got awesome stats as well, but it's a massive blog post this is. So get ready for this. But essentially, the TLDR is the game is going to remain 5v5. However, they are going to do 6v6 tests. That means different game mode styles, different sort of takes on the 6v6. How this will be done, I'm not entirely sure. Aaron does talk about things like extended tests, so maybe this won't just be a quick play hacked 6v6. And there's a lot to cover in this video, guys. But Aaron actually says this is the beginning of the 6v6 debate. It is not the end. 6v6 versus 5v5, that is, I should say. So, with all that being said, let's get stuck into this because it is going to be one hell of a video. So let's do it. It's going to be a long one. Sit down and let's see what the developers think about the state of Overwatch's format. All right, then. So here we go. Hey, everyone. There's been a lot of talk about 6v6 recently. It's only intensified in recent weeks since we posted our latest Director's Take and made a Twitter post with a promise to talk about it in the future. Well, now is the future, and this is the next piece. So let's get into that. Wait, let's not get into it quite yet. This is a pretty complex and nuanced topic, and it gets to the beating heart of what makes this game tick. Our players have different opinions and preferences about the ideal number of players in an Overwatch match, and so does our team. We're a microcosm of the broader community and discuss this internally. I'm hoping that this piece will serve as an introduction to our own discussions and a jumping off point to engage with all of you. Okay, and then goes on to say, I'd also like to set a few expectations and ground rules. First, it's pretty long. Creators are going to lose their voices reading this one aloud. I know. Tell me about it, Aaron. If you like a TLDR, the what's next section should suffice. Secondly, I'm not here to tell you what you ought to like or even what's empirically better. This is a game and your preference for fun is relative to your own tastes, ability and experience. Lastly, there are years of decisions that affect such a fundamental piece of Overwatch. Some of you might be intimately aware of these, while others might not. Before diving in, I'd like to set the stage and give some context on some of the larger changes to the game that ultimately culminated in the 5v5 format we have today. So he begins with some historical context. Let's break all of this down. There have been 3 large format changes to Overwatch, and the first happened shortly after the game launched. This was hero limits. Before this, there could be any number of a particular hero on one team. This could have, or you could have, 6 Genjis or 6 Reinhardts. If my memory serves me right, the winner of Team 4's first internal tournament was the 1 Winston and 5 Zenyatas. We call it the Quinston. Zenyatta orbs stacked with no cap to healing at the time. It was glorious and terrifying. During early development, it was necessary to duplicate heroes per team. Our first core combat milestone only had 4 heroes. As the roster grew, this was no longer necessary, and it also introduced issues. Overwatch heroes have very distinct kits with impactful abilities. Stacking abilities could be fun, but it posed challenges to balancing many of these abilities in game. People reference double barrier, but back then you could have 6. Imagine cycling 6 immortality fields. The number of team compositions and strategies available was huge. The variety was great, but we didn't feel like we could ever truly balance the game without severely watering down our heroes. So we made the choice to impose a limit of 1. In fact, let me just highlight this, guys. When I don't highlight, I lose where I am in this stuff. A limit of 1 of each hero per team. This essentially solved the issue of ability stacking, but it did have a few side effects. It traded some of the creativity in putting together team compositions for a more consistent and balanced experience. It also took away some of the choice from players. If someone wanted to play Tracer, but you were already Tracer, shout out to the meme, they would be unable to because I'm already Tracer. I've got to zoom in for this, haven't I? Terrible. Actually, there's Tracer. You see Tracer over there. Hello. Where was I? A theme of this and future decisions was limiting match variety as well as player freedom and creativity in order to create a more balanced, consistent, and competitive experience of players. Remember this point because we'll touch on it a few more times in this piece. I think the hero limit rule was a great decision and we would make it again. The other two large format changes have a lot of positive benefits but are not as clear cut. So he is starting this off with a history of how we get to 5v5 by saying, look, we didn't have hero limits and then we had to implement hero limits. Yeah, hero limits were needed. I can remember very early days of Overwatch. What would generally happen is, I'm going to say higher level games, but like now it's like a complete meme. Those players who were high level are like crap. Like they're like me now, just crap players. We're diamond if we're lucky. You know what I mean? But basically on like control maps, you would, or even any map where you had to contest a point, everybody would swap to Tracer just to get back to the point fast. So you just have loads of Tracers running around. It was a crazy time. It was a crazy time. And the esports scene at that time was mental. So definitely a change that was needed. Anyway, let's talk about the other changes. So the second large change to the game's format was the move from open queue to role queue, which, and in fact, I had an exclusive interview with Jeff, good old Jeff Kaplan, the original director of the game, about this when it got implemented, which was really cool. But anyway, which limited team compositions to 2 heroes from each role. Before role queue, there was no enforced 2-2-2 team composition, and players had the freedom to select any role they liked once they loaded into a match. With open queue, teams had a lot of freedom of choice about what heroes and team compositions to play, but there were quite a few problems that role queue intended to address. Prior to implementing role queue, there was a stark imbalance in the number of people playing each role within each match. Damage was by far, and still is today, the most popular role, and tank was by far the least popular. In fact, seeing matches with 5 or even 6 damage players on each team was not uncommon. And I don't think this comes as a shock to anybody, right? Damage is the most popular role in the game. It always has been, and it always will be. The role imbalance frequently led to wildly imbalanced matches between teams. It did. This game played better when heroes from all 3 roles were selected. The disparity caused social issues as players would try to pressure other players into playing tank or support roles, even if they didn't want to. And this totally did happen. Actually, there was another thing which happened with this. When you could look at player profiles, you would look at a player's profile and you would say, like, this happened to me actually early in the game. I played a lot of Reinhardt and Zarya, so I couldn't actually play any other role because I would, saying I get bullied was a strong way to explain it. But you get pressured into, you need to play the tank because you've got the most hours on tank. And this just was like a terrible cycle because you just kept getting more hours on tank. So it just got worse and worse and didn't go away. And this was one of the reasons why when you could hide your profile, it was actually quite good for people like me because you could get out of this tank sort of mess. It was one of the ways of getting out of it. So yeah, it does make sense what Aaron is saying there. And remember, hydrate yourself. Good Lord. Okay, so in fact, let me put this water over here because I know what I'll do. I'll throw it. I don't want to throw it. And it even made introducing new heroes more difficult since any new hero kit had to take in consideration hundreds of different team compositions and abilities that could overlap with it. The move to role queue format was aimed to mitigate these challenges. Okay. Moving to role queue solved many of these problems and added some additional benefits to the game as well. With role queue in place, matchmaking is based on skill within a given role, not just skill overall. Some players have widely different skill ratings per role, so the ability to matchmake around set roles provides a big measurable boost in match quality. Role queue also solidified the identity of each role, and the fantasy of doing that role's job became clearer, and it totally did. You know, you guys, if you're a boomer like me, you would have remembered playing Overwatch, and my example, if I was a tank player, you know, and I did used to play at GM back in the old days at the top, you know, I was actually in top 500 games, so yeah, I used to be a gamer. Now I'm terrible. But anyway, if I had to play another role, it would be terrible. It would be like I'm throwing the game. So it was a big and a good change where each individual role had its own SR at the time, or MMR, I guess. Anyway, let's move on. However, the switch to role queue system did have some downsides, the largest of which was much longer queue times. Prior to role queue, the matchmaker just needed to find 12 players of similar skill levels in order to put matches together. After role queue, it needed to find 4 players of each role to make a match. The total number of players queuing has no effect on this. It almost solely governed by the ratio of players queuing for the least popular role. Given the game's lower relative ratio of players queuing for tank than other damage and support roles, queue times went way up. We'll go into details on this later. The team tried to address this imbalance in various ways. We introduced a priority pass system. Does anyone remember that? That gave players who played low demand roles, tank, a shorter queue when they switched to damage. This had a positive effect for several weeks, but its influence quickly faded. We also introduced systems to reward players for playing tank, eventually giving them a loot box and a bunch of XP for queuing that role. None of these were able to put a dent in the demand for playing DPS. Damage queue times drifted a bit lower over time, but much of this was due to the introduction of open queue competitive. The permanent loss of damage players unwilling to wait for a long match. There were additional drawbacks with role queue. I mentioned earlier that many of our decisions made improvements to the game at the cost of match variety and player freedom. Team compositions were now locked to 2-2-2. This was another step for a more consistent experience within Overwatch, but sometimes consistency can start to feel samey. There were some pretty exciting metas in pre-role queue world, and swapping to a hero of different role mid-match was often a much bigger change and more exciting than swapping to one of the same role. Like hero limits, role queue took away a part of the freedom in selecting heroes that served as the base of Overwatch, but I often wonder if the success of it is as cut and dry as that of hero limits. Could there be an in-between version that softens the original problems without completely solving them, and also isn't quite as restrictive as our current role queue system? A bit more on that later. So kind of interesting there, sort of insinuating that what happens if we had, maybe there was a role queue system, but you could select 2 roles in a game. So you could say, I'm willing to, I don't know, I want to play DPS, but I'm also willing to play support in this game. And if I can then swap to support and DPS at the same time, what happens if we've got 3 supports on our team then? So that would be a wildly different game. But it's very interesting to see that sort of comment there from Aaron. Right then, the next bit of this video goes, and I guess this blog goes on to this. It is the third major format change. This is why they went to 5v5. So let's break this down. These challenges, as well as longer queue times, led us to the third and most recent major format change to the game, the shift from 6v6 to 5v5. This is almost a blog within a blog, but we're going to cover 3 things. Why we switched to 5v5, queue times after the switch to 5v5, what the team thinks about 6v6. Here we go. Right then, let's get straight into this. So this is why they switched to 5v5, and there are some truths here. So let's break this down. There were many reasons behind the transition to 5v5. When we launched Overwatch 2, we talked about the greater individual agency that players could have in 5v5. Overwatch is a team sport, and it requires players to rely on each other to be successful. This was even more the case previously, and the game could be frustrating if your team was out of sync. Many times, fights in 6v6 couldn't resolve until ultimate abilities came online. Correct that, until ultimate combos could be executed to break through 2 tanks worth of mitigation, supported by high, uncontested healing output. The world of 6v6 could have really high highs, but really low lows. One of the design goals of 5v5 was to try and raise that floor, even though it was at the expense of some of those high moments. And again, you guys probably will remember a lot of this, like Graviton Surge combos, like Graver. I'm trying to say Graviton and Pharah together at the same time, but like that would be a combo, right? Tracer, Pulse Bomb into Grav would be a combo. Grav combo with a lot of stuff. You'd have things like Nano Visor would be used to sort of break through enemy lines. And I think actually Nano Visor is probably a good example of something which is still used in the game today as a combo. But you can see that they've definitely moved away from comboing ultimates to make ultimates, I guess, a bit more like self-dependent. Like, yes, you can still combo them, don't get me wrong, but you still get a bit more value now, don't you, in 5v5 as opposed to 6v6, where I do agree with what Aaron's saying there. You did need to combo ultimates to break through. You know, what about a Grav and a Diva Bomb? You know, things like that. You had to sort of combo things to get that, to break through the enemy's tanks, basically. He goes on to say, Overwatch 2 also has a greater emphasis on FPS play. This was always a main goal of Overwatch 2, to make it more of a shooter and less of a MOBA. And I think that's still the goal, but we'll see. Maybe it changes in this blog. There's less damage mitigation and crowd control, which is interesting because they are slowly bringing crowd control back, aren't they? Look at the recent Cassidy change to Flashbang, or the reintroduction of Flashbang. And players get to shoot at enemies more. Crowd control could take players out of the game for extended periods of time, especially when they were chained back to back. A 5-second Sombra hack may freeze on a primary fire. Brig Bash, Anna Sleep, Orisa Hall, and Sigma Rock could all happen consecutively to one player. Typically, a tank who could often survive this onslaught, at least in game. Their real-life mental health was another story. And again, that's totally true, right? Every tank moaned about this. There was loads of viral clips all over the internet about this where tanks are just endlessly chain stun locked, basically. You couldn't do anything. It was crap. You couldn't play the game. It was crap. But did the game have to go to 5v5 to fix that? They could have just reined in crowd control effects. Anyway, it's an interesting one. Anyway, damage heroes often complain that their role was the least impactful relative to the strength of super powerful tank synergies, and support heroes undoing their playmaking. The emphasis on ability cooldown management, ult tracking, shooting barriers instead of players, and not big enough timing windows to just shoot enemies and get eliminations were all factors that contributed to this feeling. Support heroes also had to focus almost exclusively on healing since there were bigger team health pools and more incoming damage on the field with the additional tank player. In 5v5, they have more agency to add some damage or duel other heroes. Tank synergy wasn't always fun. It slowed the game down and stabilized it, but sometimes it absolutely ground to a halt. People point to the double shield meta as an example of this. It wasn't just about double shields, though. The ability to stack a very defensive-heavy lineup, especially in game modes that required a team to push through a small choke, caused a lot of matches to feel like there was no progress at all. The game is faster now, and it doesn't typically stall out. It feels like there is more room to move around the map without the need to earn every inch of it. In 5v5 fights are often less focused on moving around in a death ball formation, and there is more room to take angles, flank, and duel other players, which brings in more of the FPS gameplay. So yeah, I agree with that. I think that's fine. While 6v6 can have its high moments, it's also hard to follow. Tracking 9 other players is easier than 11. There are fewer visual effects on screen, especially during big team fights. Overwatch is a pretty demanding game, and moving to 5v5 made it a bit more cognitively manageable. Lastly, one of the biggest benefits of 5v5 was dramatically reduced queue times. Let's explore that. So before we get onto that, I think we'll just look at that last little mini paragraph there. There was no mention of Overwatch League there, and one of the issues, I don't know if you guys heard that, but one of my 3D printers. Just stop as quick. I'm making a little soap tray for one of my sisters because I'm a lovely brother like that. Anyway, I don't know if you guys even heard that, but I heard it, so you probably did. But yeah, what I was trying to say here is, I think like there's no mention of esports here. There's no mention of Overwatch League. There's no mention of like trying to reduce that visual mess which that game, or which that, I guess, format really suffered from. Because you guys remember when Overwatch 2 came out, or before it even came out, Overwatch League was playing 5v5. And the reason for that was, yeah, it was the upcoming game. They wanted to get buzz around it. But also it was to make it a bit more watchable. Because Overwatch was not watchable at all. It was crazy. There was like loads of visual effects on the screen. You had to play the game, intimately understand the game to even know what the hell was going on. If you showed it to some random gamer, they'd be like, I don't even know what's going on here, right? Whereas if you showed somebody Call of Duty, or even, I guess, Counter-Strike's a better example, or even, can I say Valorant? Valorant's got a lot of crap on the scene. Let's say Counter-Strike, right? Because everyone knows what a flashbang is. You know what a grenade is. You know what a smoke grenade is. And you know what a gun is. So yeah, we shoot the other guys and that's it. It's simple to understand. Overwatch never had that. And I do think there was a lot of pressure placed on the Overwatch team. In fact, I know from Activision and that management structure at that time. But anyway, let's move on to this because queue times. I think this is the elephant in the room, and this is, I think, the main reason why they did this. So let's talk about queue times. So queue time data and context, and I think this is, like I said, one of the main reasons why they went 5v5. Because you need to get people into your game. If people play your game, it's going to sound crazy to say this. It almost doesn't matter, does it, about match quality? Because no one wants to sit there looking at a screen that's like counting down for counting up, I guess, 8, 10, 12 minutes before you get into a match. That's crap. You want to throw them into a game straight away. And this was a way of doing it, or getting them into a game faster. Anyway, queue time data and context. The chart below shows ranked play queue times per role after the introduction of role queue to Overwatch in 2019. Compared to queue times per role in Overwatch 2's 5v5 role queue format. As you can see, the shift to 5v5 role queue dramatically reduced queue times for all players, or for players in all roles, and most notably the damage role, which is the most popular one. So let's take a look at this graph and digest it. So it's average competitive role queue time. So we've got the time in minutes going up there. We've got damage, support, and tank. So if we look at tank, I guess damage to begin with, right? So 6v6 post roll queue. Look at this, 7.5 minutes average competitive roll queue times. Look at what has happened here as soon as you go into Overwatch 2 5v5 lifetime. 2.9 minutes to get a game. That is like a dramatic increase. Well, I guess reduction in queue time, but an increase in player, number of games played, right? Or number of games got into. Players actually playing more of the game, right? Especially for DPS players. What is interesting, though, is when you look at the other roles. So if you look at support, in 6v6 post-roll queue, they were about the same time as damage, because, yeah, there were still 2 supports. And Overwatch 2 5v5 lifetime, it's at 1.4. So, again, it is still worked out. And tank was the main cause of this problem. So, tank would get very fast queues because nobody was queuing for tank. So, another way to look at this graph is the smaller it is, the less people are actually queuing those roles. And you can kind of see that support and tank, they're not wildly different. But DPS, though, is like absolutely people just want to play a DPS game. You know, it's interesting, this graph is in a lot of ways, because why haven't they just been pumping DPS heroes into the game? if people want to play DPS, just give them DPS. Anyway, you know, whatever. But yeah, it's an interesting graph. But you can see from tank anyway. So 6v6 post roll queue, 1.8 minutes, and now it's 1.3. So not much of a change for tank, but this is a dramatic change here for DPS, which I think was the thing they were trying to sort out. Again, for support, I don't think the change is too big. It's still a good change, a positive change, but this is massive, actually massive. So how does Aaron explain all of this after my insane ramblings? In fact, I best take a drink because my voice is destroyed. Okay, so the biggest factor driving the difference between, oh God, I don't want to visit Blizzard, go away, between Overwatch and Overwatch 2 queue times is the ratio of players queuing for each role. We hear players speculate that long queue times are a result of not enough players playing Overwatch. That isn't the case, but instead, that relative to other roles, players generally queue tank less, leading to longer wait times. Apologies. Leading to longer wait times for all while we wait for a tank to free up to find a proper match. Yeah, I mean, it's a game design problem, isn't it? Which, they kind of fixed with 5v5. Anyway, so in practice, the actual ratio of players queuing for tank, damage, and support is much closer to the current 1-2-2 format than the previous 2-2-2 format. As a result, the 5v5 role queue format better mirrors actual player interest in each role, and making the switch resulted in short queues. So, I mean, it makes sense. This is something I've been blabbing about for years, but yeah, reducing the number of required tanks to start a game is going to get games faster, right? You could also say on the other side of it, if you had 3 DPS, it would, like in a game, and 1 support and 1 tank, maybe that would increase, make DPS wait times less. But yeah. The sharp drop-off in queue times, but obviously that would be insane with 3 DPS in the current balance of the game. But whatever. The sharp drop-off of queue times in Overwatch of 2020 is when Overwatch 2, along with 5v5 shipped, the queue times of all heroes dropped and are now much shorter than they were in the 6v6 world. This is almost all because the game required 1 less tank in a match. If you look at the current queue times, you can see that there is still a lack of tanks compared to other roles. Just flipping the switch and returning to 6v6 would likely cause a return to the previous queue times or worse. So there you have it, everybody. That is this here is why there will never be 6v6 in the game unless there is some way of fixing it so people play tank. That's just it. People don't want to play tank. This is the reality of the game, right? I'm sure they looked at extreme stuff like just get rid of tanks altogether. I mean, I think this is probably why they were talking about making tanks brawlers back around the launch of Overwatch 2. Trying to almost move away from calling them a tank. No, you're like a brawly DPS. You're a DPS that can survive a bit longer, just to get DPS players to play tank, I suppose. But yeah, I'm sure they tried radical stuff like, let's just get rid of tank and let's just call these guys DPS, or let's turn the tanks into DPS and see what happens. Madness. Anyway, regardless, the amount of players in game, queue times are always reflective of how many people are queued per role. In other words, the main driver of increased queue times is the ratio of players queued in each role. Since there are less players queuing as tank, queues would likely go back to the way they were before. Thoughts on 6v6? So this is what Aaron and the dev teams think about 6v6. The game started its life with 6 players on each team. I discussed why we moved away from 6v6, but that doesn't mean it's without any merit. There were moments and madness that could happen with 12 players in a match that just don't quite coalesce when there are 10. It was almost too much to keep track of. Correction, it was too much to keep track of at times, but that was part of the charm. There are big moments in Overwatch 2, but they don't quite have that same chaotic, over-the-top feeling to them. Part of the chaos that allowed players to feel less pressure in a match, part of that chaos allowed players, I should say, to feel less pressure in a match. There was an extra player to take up a bit of the slack for someone that was performing poorly. And since that player was a tank, they had quite a bit of impact. There was a lot more hit points and defensive capabilities to burn through, which had a stabilizing effect on gameplay. Teams would fold a bit slower than they do now. And I think you see this focused on the tank, basically. If you've got a bad tank, the enemy team's got a good tank, you'll lose because you'll just lose. Whereas in 6v6, you still had a tank, so you could still work around it. And also, it gave more leeway to other roles to kind of be not as good. Maybe you didn't have a great DPS or a decent support to go with your other support and DPS, so your extra tank could kind of make up with it in different ways. When we went over some of the issues of tank synergy earlier, but having 2 of them allowed one to focus on protecting their backline while the other held ground or pushed into the enemy team. That's peeling, basically. You used to have a lot of that. The off-tank would peel a lot. So you'd have like a Zarya or a D.Va. Let's just use D.Va as an example. Obviously, other tanks could do it, but D.Va would peel and often put defense matrix across squishy supports like maybe your Zen or whatever, just to keep them alive when they were getting dove upon, or even try and keep DPS alive. It was peeling. You can still do it in Overwatch 2, but generally, because you're the only tank, you're sort of the one in there starting the fight anyway. You don't really want to be in the back of your team. Unless, for whatever reason, that would make sense in that moment. We know Overwatch is a complicated game. But anyway, the tank role had a lot of depth in understanding how to work with the other tank on the team. This part of the mastery curve took a long time to learn, and for the small group of people devoted to it, that was part of its allure, which it was. We mentioned the difficulty in balancing tanks for 6v6 earlier, but the past year and a half has shown us that there are issues with balancing tanks in 5v5. For much of Overwatch 2, tanks have been fairly balanced, but when one of them becomes a powerful outlier like Mauga, it can be felt strongly in the world of one tank. So this is great, actually, because it's not just a complete write-off of we're not doing 6v6. It's like, actually, there are benefits to this, and I'm going to outline them. And there are also potentially major benefits to it. So it's honestly, it's actually massive. So this is it, the what's next section. This is the return of 6v6. In air quotes, in a test format, not it's going straight into the game. But they're open to ideas, and it's also a commitment of look, we're in a 5v5 world, we're going to try and make this work. So this is what he says. Okay, that was a lot of setup, but I think I've put more effort into this than any essay I wrote in college. So where do we go from here? At the end of the day, we want to make the game that players want to play, which, based off of everything in this article, is literally a DPS game. Right? Delete tanks and just DPS everybody. Because of the challenges mentioned previously, we are focused on making 5v5 the best experience that it can be. However, because we operate as a service to our players, we'll always remain open-minded to reevaluating our decisions based on your actions and feedback to give you the best game experience we can. Rather than introduce a disruptive permanent change to the game, we prefer to explore the space further and make changes based on that exploration. So what does that mean? Well, with that said, we're looking at running a series of events to try out different core team composition formats in Overwatch 2. The community has just once or twice suggested a test. Why not put various forms of 6v6 in the game in order to gauge the results? We agree. And based on your feedback, we're exploring how we can test different forms of 6v6 in the game to gauge the results. This is taking some time, however, for reasons that might not be readily apparent. So 6v6 is going to come to the game in a test format, but there are problems, and Aaron explains problems that we wouldn't necessarily actually think of here. So he's going to explain technical problems, which we don't, as a gamer, as somebody who plays the game, you just flip the switch, turn it on, what's going on? But actually, they built Overwatch 2 being 5v5, and it means there's some engine problems. So check this out. The first, and honestly the largest reason, is the need to do this in a way that allows the game to have optimized technical performance. I'm referring to frame rate and memory constraints. With 12 players in a match, There have been quite a few upgrades and additions to Overwatch 2 that have had an impact on the performance of the game. These range from new features like allied outlines and enabling healer vision by default, the addition of more technically demanding hero kits, as well as visual upgrades to UI, heroes, and maps. In a 6v6 setting, these upgrades can have significant impacts for our players, causing the game to underperform on older systems. Overwatch is a fast-paced game, and maintaining a game that runs smoothly across all our platforms is important for the player experience. While a limited time test could arrive sooner, the team is investigating exactly how long it would take to permanently increase performance across the game. This would be a large effort that would most likely take at least several seasons to accomplish. So that is a major issue, right? If they actually even want to properly test 6v6, they'd have to invest a shitload of development hours into just making the game actually work with 12 players. So almost it's like we can't do it. It's almost like we've got to find some sort of a middle ground if we want to do that. And I think a lot of this kind of comes down to, I think that they put a dollar value on development hours, and do they want to spend, and this is, you know what guys, I'm a little bit of a rant here, but this is like when you look at issues with like the monetization in the game and you think just do a skin recolor, it takes a lot less dev time and you've got a skin recolor and it makes X amount of money, whereas deciding to go and do a crazy test for 6v6, which is going to require hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of dev hours to make the required changes to the engine to actually make it work, the producers, anybody involved with the monetary aspect of the game will just go, no, you're not doing that, because just do a skin recolor. That's why I get pissed off with skin recolors, because you don't get this kind of stuff as readily as you would before, because it's just why try harder sort of thing. Anyway, let's see what the next issue is, because that's a big issue. Another issue, and one that still gives me anxiety about opening this Pandora's box, is what to do with queue times if enough players prefer 6v6 to keep some form of it around. The team was not able to solve the issue previously. While we have some ideas now, there's no guarantee that they will work. Is there a world where people are willing to live with long queue times to play this format? Maybe, but that's a pretty risky move to make. We also have tens of millions of players that have only played 5v5. We would want to be openly mindful, not to frustrate those who like the game as it is today. Which, these are all good, valid issues. They're not just crap. It's not just filler that's been put into this article. It is like these are actual legitimate issues. So yeah, you can totally understand it. The outcome of these tests would be to give us a lot of valuable information to consider moving forward. We'd run the test for a few weeks. So if they run the test for a few weeks, it wouldn't be like a quick play hack, would it? It would be some sort of special play card or some special mode. Maybe they just did turn quick play into 6v6 for a few weeks. Like quick play super hacked or something. Then we measure the impact it had on the other experiences in Overwatch 2, like 5v5, arcade, etc. We take the lessons from this playtest to see what we can learn about the mode within the current game ecosystem and for the future of Overwatch. We would reflect carefully on the learnings from whether we run at the test we run and explore on how best to give players what's being asked for, whether that's a world of 5v5, 6v6, or even both. It's a future for us to figure out. I'm going to jump on a soapbox for a moment. When you look at the changes to Overwatch since its inception, it's clear that many of those have reduced some of the variety within an Overwatch match. We get feedback from some players that Overwatch can feel the same from game to game. While much of this gets attributed to 5v5, we feel that there is more at play here. Besides running experiments with 6v6, we'd like to run some that re-examine the ways we tried solving previous problems, specifically with the goal of bringing some freedom back to an Overwatch match without the severity of issues that accompanied it. For instance, we think there could be other ways of putting a team together that aren't quite as rigid as a set composition, but not as loose as open queue. We'll be running at least one quick play hacked based on this idea in Season 13. There are some gotchas to this direction, but after reading 400 pages of this blog, I hope you're all able to see there are trade-offs to many decisions that go into this game and into any game, really. So I think that actually is kind of like what I said earlier on in this video about 500 hours ago, where I think they're probably going to try some sort of you can maybe swap to two different roles in a game, or they open it up instead of it just being one tank, two support, two DPS. It then becomes the DPS, the tank can maybe swap to DPS. So you just get rid of the tank altogether, and then you've just got 3 DPS. That could be interesting for team comms. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that sort of pans out. So, in conclusion, Aaron says this: your feedback has driven both our inspiration and commitment to test new ideas in game. We want to be super thoughtful about how we implement new ideas into the live game because there are millions of players who jump into Overwatch each season, and we want anything we put into the game to benefit the community as a whole. Ultimately, the Overwatch team wants to continue building the game that you want to play season after season. This blog, or thesis rather, is the start of this conversation. This isn't the last time we're going to be getting into 5v5 or 6v6, and we can't wait to share more about our plans for the future. In closing, we appreciate you so much, and we love seeing your passion and dedication to the game. Team 4 in the Overwatch community. The team hears you. We see you. We're incredibly thankful to be on this ride with you. We can't wait to share more and more. Okay, so, yeah, this is like, I think, like, after going through that, it was very insightful. I think one of the things that this game has done really well, and you look at, I mean, I've been exposed to more games this year, definitely, especially in terms of content creation, but it kind of gives me a bit more of a rounded perspective on just the way other developers actually interact with their communities. And this type of communication, you know, again, you go back to the whole thing of like development hours. Well, I mean, a lot of time would have been put into producing this by the actual game director. You know, they obviously see this as something that needs to be discussed, needs to be spoken about. You can have a debate about whether that's actually even worth their time. You know, they could have just said nothing. They didn't have to answer all of this, but they decided to do it because I'm sure they've seen it as a major issue with the community. And if you do look at Overwatch 2's history, you can see there are points, and they did that, like with all the issues that competitive had. You know, you can keep going back. There are major points where the community gets riled up, and they do address it. And even to some extent, they have addressed some of the monetization issues. But I think that's sort of, you know, I get a very strong impression that most of the devs just literally blank that. It's like, whatever, it's just necessary evil, let it go. But yeah, the point I was making is I think they're very open, the Overwatch devs are, and it is great to read this kind of stuff, especially for me, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video and listening to this. But I'd like to know what you guys think about this in the comments below. I think what we're going to see is some sort of test for 6v6 coming in the future, an extended test once they can work out the technical aspect of that. We've got some sort of role queue selection, quick play hacked coming in season 13. And yeah, probably something else I've totally forgot as well. Oh, and a history of how we got to this point and how they're willing to actually, like, I think actually, you know, that probably is the main takeaway from this. The literal leader of this game is saying, look, we are open to changing major systems and even things we've changed in the past. And it's a little bit of a different tune than the Blizzard of old that were never wrong. They were always right. You will take your medicine. And yeah, and you know, I've been around a lot of these guys. Probably most of them are not even at Blizzard anymore. And you did get this air of like, I don't even know how to say this. It was like an air of superiority. It was like, we're gods. You know what I mean? And I guess in some ways they were in their world. But I mean, you know, you've got to be humble sometimes, right? Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening or watching the video. And yeah, let me know, like I said, what you think about all of this. I think this video is, I don't even know how long this is, probably about 50 minutes long or something crazy. I need to go and get some food. Let me know what you think about this. I'll catch you guys on the next one. See you soon.